Hello everyone, this is going to be a sort of a ramble with a theme, sort of stimulated really by a couple of videos I've watched on YouTube recently. First one being another one of the very enjoyable rambles by Terry Crick. There's something about Terry's delivery and his wargaming kind of interests that I feel like I kind of gel with it. I think he's got a very kind of similar mentality to me. But he was talking on his last video about how he's flitting from one interest to another, and his interests are kind of sparked by very random kind of events and so on. So he was planning to get into 1812 war in America, and then suddenly came across a book on his bookshelf about the Jacobite rebellion and is instantly sort of switched to that. But the thing that was interesting to me was that he was kind of using his bookshelf in a very kind of similar way to I do. I kind of like look at my bookshelves just to kind of remind myself of old interests that I had and try and kind of rekindle enthusiasm for them. So after I'd watched his video, I took a look at my bookshelf, just going through old books that I used to find, really interesting to read that I haven't looked at in a long time. And one that came to light was this one, which older wargamers with an interest in the American Civil War will certainly know this book, but I'm wondering now whether it's as widely known as it used to be. It's Battle in the Civil War by Paddy Griffiths. It was released in 1986, and at first glance it's a very kind of unremarkable publication. There's no colour in it whatsoever. It's entirely in black and white, but the layout of it is somehow it's really it's designed to be a really kind of comfortable read, but at the same time packing in masses and masses of really kind of valuable information. The subtitle for it is Generalship and Tactics in America 1861 to 65. So it's very much at the kind of macro end of wargaming. It's always struck me that it would be a particularly good resource to base wargames rules for very large actions such as 6mm battles and so on. It deals with all the kind of elements of how to supply and how to organize your armies and your corps and march them to battle, keep them supplied, make sure that their training kicks in and that all the various arms interact as they should do with one another and so on. So here you've got a section on transmitting the commander's orders and the telegraph system and so on, how orders filter down to the various units, deploying the army on the battlefield. So it's broken down here into the reserve areas and then the sort of actual front lines of the two opposing armies with where the artillery is placed and so on. There's sections on how to kind of interpenetrate friendly units and so on. It's just masses and masses of detail. You can see how tightly printed it is and so on. And the other thing I like about it is that the illustrations, although they're not in colour, they're really wonderfully drawn, and there's almost in some pages there's almost like a comic book kind of presentation to it, but with really kind of dense, informative kind of information that goes into masses and masses and masses of detail about all kinds of things, how to build defense works. So it gives you an idea of what things looked like as well. But anyway, the thing that one of the reasons that I pulled it down off my shelf and had a look at it, as well as being being influenced by Terry's video, was that there's been a couple of other people posted videos recently on the subject of Napoleonic artillery, so Napoleonic rather than in the American Civil War, but some of the principles are similar in both the periods. One of them was Mary Hinge, so Jim at Mary Hinge, who he made this remark about how he had, I think it was a British artillery piece that he'd just painted up for the Napoleonic Wars, and he made this remark about how he wasn't sure whether he'd place the various figures in the correct position in relationship to the cannon. And he might have made some mistakes about that. So that kind of implied that he wasn't really sure precisely where each individual would have stood, because he had figures with one had a ramrod and I don't know, another one may have been holding a cannonball or something like that. And the other person who had a very kind of similar remark, but not in a kind of lack of knowledge way, was Leon T66, who put up a video showing his 3 finished Austrian artillery pieces from the Napoleonic Wars. And he made the point that he had got one with the gun firing, and I think the other one was either with them training the gun, or with it being reloaded. And then there was a howitzer, which is a slightly different kettle of fish. But anyway, that got me thinking about how we model artillery pieces on the table, and whether we do it in a realistic way in terms of how we put the figures around the gun and so on. Because clearly with Leon's models, they had been designed with the figures actually performing the actions that were appropriate for a particular sequence in the firing of the gun. So it had been quite cleverly thought out. Whereas with Jim, it had just been a case of he had various artillery figures and he wasn't quite sure where to put them. Now, I immediately thought of this book because I was sure that in here somewhere there was a section on the precise sequences of how you fired a artillery piece during the American Civil War. And I have tried I've gone through this book now with a fine tooth comb and I can't find it, so my memory must have misled me in that respect. But this is the kind of book you would expect to find that kind of detail in. So I then had to sort of think, well, where on earth did I come across it? The only thing that I can think where it was, where have I put it? Oh, here we are, down here. I've also got these other books on my bookshelf that I've had for quite a long time. These came out in the late 80s, and you'll probably be more familiar with these, I don't know. Let's open it up a little bit. So there are 3 of these books. I've got 2, in hardback. So there's this one, The Fighting Men of the Civil War, and there's this one, Commanders of the Civil War. There was also one, let me see, softback. Yeah, there was also one called The Battlefields of the Civil War. Now I've got both of these two books and The Battlefields of the Civil War again in softback. So I've got them boxed together as this complete set of three in softback that I found in a second-hand bookshop a couple of years ago. So I have got this set, but this is the particular book that I've been able to find what I think I must have been remembering falsely as being in that other Paddy Griffiths book. This book is fantastic for detailed illustrations as well as very good text, but it's got lots and lots of examples of all the different elements of an army. I mean, this particular chapter called Rolling Thunder is obviously about artillery. I'm going to come back to some of these pages later on, but anyway, in here I found this paragraph here. So what I want to do is just read this out to you, and you'll get an idea of the way that the various artillery crew operated as a team, because that is quite that's the nub of this question about where they would have stood around the gun and so on, and what each one's particular function was. So this paragraph reads, north and south most artillerymen could have been interchanged and they would have been able to function without flaw. The routine was unvaried unless the special nature of the gun required it. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. Gunner number 2 was handed a cartridge of ball and powder, which he sat inside the muzzle of the cannon. So, in other words, there is the missile itself. When we're just in this particular instance, it's just a solid shot, a ball, like this one here. But it's wrapped together with the explosive charge, which was, I'm not sure whether they did get around to doing that in the Napoleonic Wars. They may well have had the powder charge in a separate bag, so it was pre-measured, because it's very important to have the correct amount of explosive material. Otherwise, you're risking damaging the cannon itself and so on, or not achieving the correct distance, for your target. So anyway, yeah, which he sat inside the muzzle of the cannon. Gunner number 1, who never let go his rammer, so he is the man, one of your figures would have a ramrod, shoved the cartridge down the tube until it reached the bottom. Meanwhile, gunner number 3 kept his thumb, sometimes protected by a leather sleeve, over the vent hole at the breech. Right, so very often you'll have a figure that seems to be doing that, is sort of reaching out, and he is the one that's holding his thumb over the area that's going to be ignited to discharge the cannon. Once the cartridge was in place, he jabbed a wire pick through the vent to open the cloth bag at the base of the cartridge, exposing the black powder within. Gunner number 4, who sometimes wore a pouch on his belt, which contained friction primers, rather like blasting caps, now placed a primer into the vent hole. A lanyard, several feet of braided cord, was attached to the primer, and at the proper command, a jerk at the lanyard ignited the primer, which in turn sent a blast of flame into the cartridge, discharging the piece. Immediately, number 1 reappeared, this time with a soaked sponge, which he rammed down the barrel to put out any remaining embers or glowing fragments of the cartridge which might accidentally set off the next round prematurely. Gunner number 5 ran forward with another cartridge and handed it to number 2, and the whole process repeated itself. If the round happened to be an exploding shot or shell, then gunners 6 and 7, who manned the ammunition chest and handed cartridges to number 5, cut the fuses according to the anticipated time of flight to the target. Now, there's an awful lot there, and various kind of implements and instruments did vary a lot, or a little rather, between the type of cannon and also between the periods and the type of projectile that you were firing. So where to start? Right, so this is the ramrod here. This was gunner number 2 who was holding onto this, remember. There are 2 ends to it. One is the actual thing that he uses to ram the charge down, the charge and the projectile down the muzzle of the cannon, but the other end has a sponge, which there will be a bucket that he will put the sponge into the bucket of water and then rinse out the actual bore of the cannon after it's been fired to get rid of any sort of burning embers that might still be inside the gun. Otherwise, when you put the next charge down, that can set light and injure you as you're trying to load the cannon. So, in other words, if the figure that you're placing on the stand happens to have the sponge end pointing towards the muzzle, then the gun has already fired. So there's no point then in putting another figure down the other side pulling on a lanyard, because that would suggest that he is firing the gun at the same time as it's being rinsed out. So this is why the figures that Leon had, it was quite cleverly thought out that mistake wouldn't happen. But it's case in point about how I make this mistake all the time. Especially when you're using a base that can't accommodate a lot of figures, which is very often the case. In 15mm, for instance, very often, say in the Fire and Fury rules, there's hardly any room at the front of the stand to put a figure holding this ramrod stroke sponge. So sometimes I put it at the back, and that's completely the wrong place. It's a completely inappropriate place, but sometimes space demands that. Also notice that sometimes you've only got room, and the rules only require you to place 2 or 3 figures around the artillery piece. As you can see, I mean, how many did it go up to? It went up to at least 7, didn't it? Yeah, 6 and 7. So you've got 7 men that you need to man the gun. I mean, obviously, as casualties take place, then roles get chopped and changed, and sometimes one person would have to do the role of 2 artillerymen and so on. But you know, that's another thing that is unrealistic in wargaming. It's partly that we place figures in the wrong place, partly that we place figures doing conflicting actions together, and partly that we don't and we can't put enough figures around it to represent the proper crewing of a gun. Now, the other thing on this business about the cartridge of ball and powder, I wonder if they've got an example of that in here. No, you see, there they've got separate cannonballs without the cartridge. I could probably find one if I spent long enough on it, but it's probably not worth. It's not worth too much. There you can see an example, by the way, of gunner number 2 rinsing the sponge Yeah, here we are. Here's an illustration, in fact, of the cartridge. So you've got the ball at the end and the bag with the specified amount of powder. Now, prior to this pre-weighed amount of powder being put into a pouch like that, you'll find on a lot of earlier figures, that maybe for the 18th century certainly, you would have something that looked like a big spoon, and that was actually designed so that you would pick up, it would hold the appropriate amount of powder. You would place it in the gun, and then you would rotate it so that the powder fell out, and then you would withdraw this instrument. Now, I doubt very much. I don't think that was employed by the time of the American Civil War. It may have been during the Napoleonic Wars, but what I'm going to do later on in this video is show you a little sequence of a gun being fired that uses that particular instrument. They don't use it in the appropriate way because they actually put a small charge that's in a bag onto it rather than scooping up loose gunpowder. But it does show you how it was employed. And another interesting thing to note about that is when you're painting artillery pieces, anything that comes into contact with gunpowder that is metallic is very often made of copper. So I do it as well. I paint them steel colours and iron colours, but copper is particularly appropriate because when it grates against other abrasive material, it doesn't spark. It doesn't give off sparks. So that is another thing about the lids of these limbers. Very often, if they're metal, they will be copper, and it's to avoid accidental sparking and igniting of gunpowder. There was another one here. This instrument here is known as a worm, and it's designed to scour the inside of the gun barrel, which they didn't actually mention, did they, in that sequence of events? But that becomes necessary as the burnt powder begins to accrue on the inside of the bore. So all these things do matter if you're going to be really kind of pedantic about where you're going to put your figures. I mean, there was another one here about one of the was it gunner number 4? Yeah, gunner number 4. He sometimes wore a pouch on his belt, so it's not just accidental if some of your figures do have a pouch on their belt. That is particularly for the American Civil War. That person is representing gunner number 4, and that pouch contains these friction primers, and that is another point as well, that in the Napoleonic Wars in particular, more often than not, the gun would be fired with a match. So you'll have a figure who is holding a burning length of material that's been imbued with cordite, say. So it's a slow burning fuse that is capable of igniting powder. So if that were the case, then you wouldn't have someone standing there with a spike to put it through the vent hole and pierce the bag. You would have loose powder at the end of the cannon, and then you would have to fill the vent hole with a priming charge of loose gunpowder, and then set light to it with a burning match. Okay, so that is going to be another difference between the American Civil War and the Napoleonic War, whereas it was putting on a lanyard that set off this friction primer, and then ignited the charge. Whereas in the Napoleonic Wars, you're going to have someone standing there with a long kind of thing that looks like a long stick, and they are going to be the one that ignites the charge. So they need to be at the rear of the gun, obviously. I mean, some of these things is kind of common sense, but what tends to happen more often is that you'll have someone standing at one side of the gun with their thumb over the hole, and someone that's also standing there igniting the fuse, before the powder's even been put in. So if you want to be really kind of finicky about it, you want to try and avoid that. Yeah, so I think that is everything that I wanted to say on the point. I hope it kind of helps. I mean, it's going to be common knowledge to a lot of war gamers. So it's really. Oh yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say. Yeah, of course, I knew there was something. There isn't just solid shot that you're firing. You can also fire canister, miniature kind of projectiles that are for short range that burst out and pepper the enemy with like a shotgun. But there are also shells. Now shells are kind of hollow balls, again most of you will know this, that contain a kind of an explosive charge, so they explode at a certain point and will either explode in the air and shower the enemy with broken bits of the shell or shrapnel, and there are also shells that land on the ground and then explode. Now, in the Napoleonic Wars, those shells were round, and they would have a fuse coming out of the round sphere, and that would be burning. Now, the reason it burns is because they discovered in the 18th century that if you fired a gun, the combustion from the actual explosion that was forcing the projectile out of the gun was sufficient to set light to the fuse. So you didn't need to light the fuse separately and then fire it at the enemy, which is something they did in the 16th century, the 16th and the 17th centuries. But they discovered in the 18th century that it was an unnecessary risk, that the fuse in the shell itself would ignite as it was fired. Now, that isn't possible with a rifled gun. So by the time you get to the American Civil War, they are still firing some spherical shells, but you have rifled guns that require some kind of sabot at the end of the projectile, and you can see it's got more of a kind of missile shape, like a bullet kind of shape with a bullet shaped nose, so that so this will expand as it's forced out of the gun, and then it conforms with the rifling of the gun, which gives it a spin, and the whole thing takes off. And because of the rifling, and because that is a more efficient way of using the force of the explosion, it will travel further and it will travel straighter. But because it's expanded, it's excluded that space, so the combustion can't get around to ignite the fuse. So you have to have some other method of igniting the fuse in the shell for this to explode. Otherwise it's just going to be solid shot. And what they came up with was various methods for the shell to impact, and then for there to be something that would compress, and it would be that would literally detonate the charge. It would force down on a primer, which would then detonate and ignite and then explode the charge in the shell and burst it open. So that wouldn't that kind of impact kind of fuse wouldn't have been possible on a spherical shell anyway, because you don't know which part of the shell is going to hit the target. Whereas with this, it should hopefully always be flying straight and true. Some of them did tumble, in which case there's a possibility they wouldn't explode. But if it fired efficiently and it went straight, then it would be this point that would hit the target or the ground and explode. So again, if you're representing a Parrott gun in the American Civil War, Parrott gun is a particular kind of rifled cannon with a reinforced breech, and because the explosive force was a lot more powerful, it had to be reinforced. Then you don't want to put next to that someone, say, cutting a fuse, because the fuses in the round shells would be cut to length so that they exploded at the appropriate moment, rather than landing on the ground and fizzling away, so that someone at the target end could rip the fuse out of the shell and stop it exploding, or chuck it overboard, as they often did at sea. You want it to explode as soon as it gets to its target, so that there's no chance to intervene and stop it detonating. So if you've got someone cutting fuses next to a limber, then you don't want that person crewing a Parrott gun. Equally, you don't want no, yeah, that's all. That, yeah, I'll stop at that point. So what I'll do now is just show you the video that I took at Crown Hill Fort a couple of years ago, and it's a sort of demonstration of firing a gun, not with a projectile in it, just a bit of packaging that they fire, just so that it gives some kind of force to the explosion, and you get an idea. But the things that you don't see are you don't see the cartridge and shell. They literally use this sort of scoop type device, rather than having a measured amount of material, but they do put a measured amount of explosive into the shell, but they use it in the way that's appropriate for loose gunpowder. And what else don't you see? Yeah, they fill the vent hole with more powder to prime it, so there's no primer fuse or anything like that. There's no lanyard. It's actually ignited with a burning match. So it's a bit of a kind of mix of various kind of devices, but at the same time it does give you an idea of the various elements of loading a gun and so on, and the risks of doing it inadequately. And of course the other thing to mention is, the more skilled and the more trained your artillery crew are, the more shot and shell they can get off in any particular time period. So that does become, the more you can slimline this process, the greater your rate of fire, which is another reason to have the shot and the pre-measured amount of explosive together in one cartridge, rather than putting them in separately, which is what they do in this demonstration. So all these things are kind of honed to make it as fast as possible. Anyway, let's play you the clip of the dummy firing.
We didn't get any water in the barrel. It doesn't work too well when there's water in the barrel. The tool I've got in my hand now is a worming tool, and we want to make sure there isn't any residual charge or anything left in the barrel of the gun. Ed is just drying the flash pan, so it gives us a bit of an edge on what we're going to do. So standing to one side of the gun, Don't want to stand in front of it in case there is anything in there and it goes off. It's the last place you want to be. So in, check, nothing in there. I also check that the barrel is the full length there. The next thing we need to do is use the scoop. This is copper. Those who are used to mining charges and things like that will find that copper was always used, so you didn't strike any sparks in against a metal object or a stone. Here, the last thing we want to do is cause a spark in the barrel when we're actually putting the charge into the barrel. So, we'll have a look at the charge. One charge onto the scoop. Now what we're going to do, we're going to fire 2 ounces of black powder. That's the intention anyhow. So it's on the scoop, so we can place that into the barrel. Again to one side. Right at the end of the barrel, rotate, and the charge should be in there. The next thing we have is some wadding. Now we're not going to fire a projectile, but we are going to tap this in so we can get some back pressure in the barrel itself. Up inside. Okay? So that way in? Yep. Ram rod. So we're going to ram that in tight. Powder. It's a fine grade of gunpowder. So
you tapped it hard enough, it'll be fine. Takes a fair amount of that. Eventually it will pile up on the flash pad like so.
So wait, safe distance. Bigger bang than expected. And we're going to use a match which is saltpeter basically impregnated into cotton. A bit like a sash cord. Now on the count of 3 we want you to give us a little bit of help. And that is, we want you to say, shout out as loud as you can, firing, so our neighbourhood here has some idea that we're actually going to fire the gun. Are you ready? Yeah. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Firing! Did you get that? I'm going to take the gun safe. And then you can come and have a look at it. That's the idea, isn't it?
She's seen it before.
You can have a smell at it as well. So that's now cleared any residual charge that might have still been in there. You can now come and have a little look.
Okay, hope that was of interest to you then, and of use. The one thing that occurred to me watching it was that there are another group of figures that I haven't mentioned yet, that didn't come up on that video, but the guns would have to be sighted and pointed in the appropriate direction and so on, and after each discharge of the cannon, very often the recoil would push the gun back and make it not be pointing exactly where the gunner wanted it to point. So you might get figures that are moving the wheel. So if a figure's got arms outstretched and to the width of the or diameter of the wheel of the gun, then you should really put that figure up against the wheel of the gun. And also you'll get other figures that are looking over the barrel of the gun and trying to sight it. And it's occurred to me, I've never actually seen it, but there's no reason why you couldn't have a figure who was raising and lowering the gun by changing that thread, the screw underneath the back of the of the gun there, so that might be possible. But again, it's the same thing, that you don't want someone doing that at the same time as you've got someone else firing the gun. So you've got three separate groups of figures really that you could separate out by function. One is kind of preparing the gun for firing, another is firing it, and the other is aiming the gun. So maybe that would help to do it that way. Anyway, that's enough of me waffling. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. See you on the next video. Bye for now.